All right, everybody, we're going to get started. I wanted to first introduce myself, and we're going to each introduce ourselves, but I wanted to introduce the title. We're talking about cloud collection, processing, and hosting. So all those things that you either are doing or will be doing in the cloud. We'll cover some of the technical elements, the security elements, some of the challenges of dealing with the cloud, and then some legal discussion on GDPR, because that's on everyone's mind. There was a full session on GDPR that Jason spoke on earlier, but we'll touch on it here as well because I think there's some applicability. So the speakers, my name is Richard Lutkus. I'm a partner at Seyfarth Shaw in the San Francisco office. My practice is dedicated to e-discovery, cybersecurity, digital forensics, and I run the West Coast e-discovery for the firm.
I'm Bill Lederer, Chief Security Officer at KCure.com. I have responsibilities for application security, network security, certification, and a bunch of other stuff.
And I'm Jason Priebe. I also work at Seyfarth Shaw here in Chicago, not far from here. And I do work, and have for a number of years, helped companies involved in large-scale, complex class action litigation, internal investigations, and the routine business operations manage data, not only in e-discovery, but also in cross-border situations.
Okay, so we're going to go through our agenda real quick. I mentioned a little bit about this, but essentially we're going to start with some of the considerations for enterprise. This applies to whether you are in-house at a corporation or if you're a vendor who is going to be offering cloud services to your end clients, also law firms. We'll talk about the benefits, some drawbacks, which some of you may be aware of, some maybe you don't, and discuss some of the security and remediation concerns that often pop up with the use of cloud technology. We'll talk about some e-discovery implications. Like I said, preservation. How do you get data out of the cloud for preservation? Can you freeze it in place? Do you have to actually export it? How do you export it if you're going to do that? And some of the limitations of doing so. We'll talk about hosting, and then we'll go into the privacy analysis of some of the current governing laws regarding cloud computing globally, and touch on GDPR and your cloud provider. So for the first part, I'm going to hand it over to Bill. But first, I wanted to start with the Steve Jobs quote because I think that everyone likes him and he was smart. So this was I forgot to put the date in here. I apologize, but this was quite obviously he passed away, but this was quite a few years ago, and he kind of envisioned the idea that your computer is not always going to be the sole point of your data. That accessing your data from other locations without actually access to your physical device was the future, and I think that's probably where iCloud came from, and the products that started long ago that have kind of migrated to now. So. Anyway, let's start with some of the benefits and drawbacks. Bill, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. So benefits and drawbacks of the cloud. Some of the fairly obvious benefits that you'll hear from cloud vendors, or you're just reading or just kind of thinking about it a little bit, that there's less maintenance of hardware that you have to do. So instead of standing up all the servers that you would need for a really big inside infrastructure, you can rent the cloud or pieces of the cloud and stand it up that way. You don't have to worry about the base software. You don't have to worry about the networking, the physical parts of that. You can take care of that in the cloud. So if you don't have the infrastructure in-house, then there's a whole bunch of employees that you don't have to hire to run this. You don't have to hire cable guys. You don't have to hire people who stand up the servers. You don't have to rotate the servers out. One of the advantages of cloud is that you can scale as you need it. You can scale up from a very small thing to a very big thing if you're cracking passwords, or maybe if you're doing Bitcoin or whatever you might need to do. You can scale it up very easily. You can also kind of maybe moderate a risk that you fear if you're kind of worried about a hurricane hitting, say, Iowa. You can get another data center a little further away and replicate between the two of them, so that you are not sort of a geographical risk. The cost, if you manage it well, can be less than traditional servers. Certainly you're not paying for electricity directly, not paying for air conditioning. This is all wrapped into the what you would pay for the cloud fees themselves. Provisioning time, we've got some experience with this ourselves, in that provisioning times tends to be less than classical servers. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But you don't have to run CDs around, and so you can easily install them from all kinds of different, very easily available sources. You can the services to this can be available anywhere if that's what you want. You can also obviously lock it down a bit. You can reduce your reliance on local storage. The risk of having a disk on your premises that has bad stuff on it, that leaks or could walk out the door, is reduced because it's very hard to get into the data centers to actually steal physical disks if your stuff is in the cloud. There's a tremendous number of features available to you as a deployer of your solution in the cloud. Scale sets, VMs, network security groups, different kinds of operating systems that you can install. AWS, you can install FreeBSD. On Azure, you can install various varieties of Linux if you need. And so there's a tremendous number of solutions that are available from the cloud vendors themselves, plus people who've built other cloud solutions that have all manner of things that are available. And the way that the cloud systems are built is that there's a lot of redundancy, high availability, and I think your stuff ends up being stored in a couple of places, even if you don't really ask for it. So that there's a failover that's capable, and you can do effectively a hot backup of your entire data center. Now, some of the challenges that you might face, you might encounter these, is that the data transfer speeds might be a little bit less than if you are 4 feet away from your server, as you might expect. There are some things that can mitigate that. There's high-speed solutions such as Aspira that can help load data more quickly than conventionally. You can't, if somebody delivers a drive to you that's got data that needs to go into the cloud, there are trucking services, I guess, that go to AWS that have trailers full of drives to import that. So there's a whole protocol that you have to go through if you have a drive that's got a lot of data on it. It isn't as easy as hooking it up to the frame that you have there. Because of the rich configuration options available, you can effectively make a walled garden, or they have a walled garden where you can lock your customers, or you yourself can be locked into services. So if you've built a solution to one cloud vendor, you might have trouble moving it to AWS. This can actually work in your benefit as well, actually. Sometimes it can be harder to implement customizations to different systems. If you need a really old version of some OS or something else, you might have trouble finding it, but then again, one would ask, why are you actually doing that? Integration into your on-premise LAN requires a lot of consideration and thought as to how you actually do that and how the IP addresses might map and so on. Securing data transfer to and from the cloud can be a particular challenge to make sure that it's encrypted in transit appropriately and encrypted at rest. Now, if you're in the cloud, you're reliant on somebody else's SLA, and so when you go into the cloud service, you want to kind of carefully read the SLA terms and make sure that it's resonant with what your needs are and what your customers might be asking you to do.
Yeah, and just for those who don't know, SLAs are service level agreements. You get these from all your cloud providers. I'll say that historically, when we've had clients who said, hey, we have an SLA from Amazon, let us know what terms we should push back on. It's not easy to negotiate with them because Amazon kind of creates this boilerplate that they expect you as a customer, for the most part, will accept without a lot of back and forth. So if you're a client who tends to redline contracts a lot and ask for specialized requirements, it's going to be an uphill battle with those. So just be aware that a lot of those you may be able to handle in the contract in terms of expectations, but the service level agreements, are built to say, hey, what's our uptime going to be overall for this product? What's the reliability in terms of network speed? All those things are broad for that, the product that they're offering. So they're not going to change the reliability for you necessarily, or they may have a separate tier that has more reliability and therefore higher costs. So just be aware of those when you're going to negotiate contracts with your service providers. Is they sometimes will have different tiers that afford you different protections, and sometimes cheaper ones that maybe for just cold storage you don't really care quite as much. Maybe uptime of 95% is fine. Who knows? So just be aware to look at those in terms of what are you actually getting in these tiers, and don't assume that these are all going to be very much the same, because I think depending on the system you have and the kind of failovers you have for your system, they could be wildly different. So.
And there's another wrinkle to SLAs which you don't normally think about, and that is that what is that vendor's response to reporting to you if they've had an incident and a security attack on their system. And that's typically not negotiable. They have their own set procedures, and that'll be part of their SLA. So the SLA can include not only the uptime, but also other particular features of it. So you want to pay attention to that and make sure that it meshes with what your needs are. Another advantage is that that a cloud might be a little bit easier for a government to issue a subpoena to get data out of it, and there's a lot of discussion about that I'm not qualified to talk about, but that have to do with where it's geographically located and so on. And so whether that's really a problem or you want to kind of be sure what your geography is. Some additional cloud challenges include exactly where is my data. So if your customer needs to know where your data is and they ask you, well, what county is Azure Midwest in? Well, you may not actually know. It's going to be hard to tell. And so the actual physical location of your data is pretty much up in the air. I mean, you may know what region it's in, but beyond that, it may not be entirely obvious.
Yeah, and just because it's tied to a specific region doesn't necessarily mean it's not replicated to another one for backup or disaster recovery. And typically that is something you want. You may have something in Virginia and something in Oregon. So you may have data in two spots or somewhere in between or in transit as they're syncing. So it's not as easy to define as where is the data center. That's an easier question because it's a physical building. Here you've got, the cloud is really just a group of servers that are tied together to do a specific purpose. And so, the issue with this is sometimes you've got, if you have to define exactly where all your data is, and we'll get to why that's important with GDPR, it's not as easy as just saying, I put it in Virginia, so it's got to just all be there.
Right, so, and sometimes your customers are going to insist on a particular geographic location, just segueing on to what Richard said, that if you have a customer that's in Europe, then you kind of have a problem in putting your data in Iowa. So, nonetheless, cloud providers are sensitive to this, and they're aware of those. They're aware of those needs, but that's something you have to make sure you check. So, how do you know the data center is well run? How do you know they're doing the right things with respect to their own vulnerability management? Who can get access to these things? And that's a consideration that is now a fairly mature thing for most of the cloud providers. Microsoft for Azure has some ungodly number of certifications, I think on the order of 50, some of which I haven't particularly heard of, but they're very aggressive in getting the certifications that are necessary. Some stories I've heard about the iCloud, so physical access to even the people who are authorized to get to the servers that are in the iCloud. They print up a badge that gives them access to it, and there's a blender, an honest-to-God blender that sits outside the room that the person has to put the badge in when they're finished. So there's no chance of reusing the badge or anything else. And so cloud providers are fairly sensitive to that sort of thing nowadays. They weren't always, but they are a little bit now. So you want to check what they have, what their certification is, and what their security practices are. And I always like to look at the security culture of an organization, kind of as a penetration tester and somebody who certifies vendors. I think one of the key things in looking at a vendor is what is their culture? What do they look like top to bottom for security? It isn't just the security team, but does the CEO of the company really care about security? Do all the people that are in HR, do they care about security? And that can be kind of an indication. That's actually the first step that I look at when I'm authorizing a vendor.
Yeah, and if you're using more of a private cloud, like for example, Relativity vendors, don't be afraid to ask for their security audit. They may not want to share the whole thing with you, but they can share some findings with you or share redacted versions. It often that transparency helps you understand what your risk is, and you can take steps to mitigate it with that vendor depending on the sensitivity of the matters you have with them. But I would say all the vendors that I've used in the past 10 years, when starting a new relationship, we typically ask for, what is your most recent security audit results? And they'll either share the report or they'll just say, let's have a phone call. And either way, delivering the message about what their weaknesses are. Sometimes there's an NDA involved, sometimes not. But in any event, it's nice to hear what they're doing and what they say. Hey, here's where we're weakest, and here's how we're addressing it. Because at the end of the day, my client as the end corporation is going to want to make sure that their data is secure, and they're giving it to their law firm and entrusting it with us, and we're choosing a vendor in some cases if they don't already have one. So the trust model has to flow down, from the client all the way to the end vendor. And so, don't be afraid to ask, like, hey, what were the results of your recent security audit? Find out what their physical security is, both in their data centers, in their offices, review centers. Do they have badge swipes? What are how does that work? Do they have building security? All that stuff is important to try to really build a framework around how you are protecting the end client's data.
So there's a number of fairly easy things that you can do to do that evaluation. The first question that I ask nowadays is, are you ISO 27001 certified? Do you follow NIST, those particular standards in NIST? Do you do a COBIT thing? Are there some other certifications that you can share? And most of these that are associated with a certification agency, there is a certificate that they will send you, or you can go to their trust center and you can view their certificate, and it can tell you what all the controls are that they have done. And that's a fairly easy thing to do. Short of that, there's any number of questionnaires that are available floating around that people who've done this will send to, well, cloud vendors, but also other vendors that have between 25 and 512 questions that relate to their individual security. And I know this, I'm not making those numbers up, trust me. So is it as far as the service, isn't it just somebody else's service? And I think by now you can see that we're saying that it really isn't, because there's a whole bunch of layers of things that they're doing for you as part of the cloud provider. They're looking at the networking, they're buying good hardware, they're buying redundant hardware. And so the services they provide depends upon the vendor, and that is that are they providing you the hypervisor? Are they providing you VMs? Are they updating the VMs? And so in any case, it's almost always more than just someone else's server if you're interested in a real business, in a business compatible cloud. And I know I like to see blinking lights, but you don't get to see that unless you make a little kind of web interface that simulates the blinking lights. But
you can have a VM with blinking lights, Bill.
You can have a VM with blinking lights, or you can have a nice Kibana thing that shows you some interesting stuff that come out of it. So there's substitutes for blinking lights. And if you need a particular OS to run, most of them have a good range of them to choose from. I mentioned that AWS obviously has Linux, but they also have FreeBSD. I think DigitalOcean, you can get OpenBSD. And so most of the vendors are really pretty sensitive to the need for multiple different OSs.
And AWS, you can even build your own. I know some,
right.
like Elcomsoft has their own. We'll touch that later. It's their own custom Windows deployment that you can request, and they have it, I think, now in Portland and Ireland, if I recall. So it's also dependent on where they allow that image to be placed. But Bill, you mentioned DigitalOcean. I know Vultr allows you to upload your own ISO. So if you want to have your own testing environment and use whatever OS you want, as long as you can upload it in an ISO format, you can install it. So that's extremely flexible for testing and quick setup.
Sure. Some other challenges. One of the ones that I think is forensically interesting is safe permanent destruction of data. So this is actually kind of a problem. If you think back to without cloud, there's if I've got a spinning disk, how do I erase data from it? Or if I have an SSD, how do I erase data from it? And there's sort of protocols for that, and they kind of depend upon you having access to this device yourself or inside of a laptop or a server. But in the cloud, what is it that you can do? Well, it's a little bit less certain in the cloud because the data could be kind of scattered based on their redundancy in the backup. So in Azure, if you delete a blob, what happens to the bits? It's actually kind of hard to tell. The real solution to this is kind of a particular encryption, a file level encryption that's installed that for that particular thing, if you want it completely deleted, then you destroy all copies of that key. Now, keep in mind that presumes that you know how to manage keys, which itself is a non-trivial activity. And there's a link here that that talks about how Google actually does it, and it's really very entertaining because who knew that Google effectively backs up the internet to tape? And they actually do, and they've invented this thing that's called RAID for tape that nobody else has done. And the way that if you have Google data and you say, I want to be completely forgotten, then what they do is they have a per user key that they know how to destroy all copies of it, and so instantly it's gone. That's all they have to do. So just keep in mind that if you've got data that's backed up somewhere and you need to delete that data, then there's some of the challenges that you have to do. Security and remediation. So cloud providers didn't start out this way, but now they are. I remember the day when AWS, you couldn't put anything that had to do with credit cards in AWS. And they decided, well, PCI may be kind of important. And so all the cloud vendors, all the major cloud vendors today are really very sensitive to security needs. And there's a lot of talent that's involved. All these major cloud vendors have red teams whose job it is often stated as, okay, your job is to reduce the stock value of the parent company, meaning that they really have a wide range of rights to go hack anybody, including the CEO, the security team, and so on. So they're very interested in this topic today. That's really the red team, and the blue teams are the people who are the defenders, who build walls and kind of do the monitoring, and they're the SecOps people who look for little funny things that happen that shouldn't be happening. And they develop an ISMS. ISMS means Information Security Management System, which is a whole discipline that ISO 27001 is an example of what addresses that. What are the security practices? How do you gather this? What are the controls that you use? What is the evidence that you collect? How do you check if the evidence has high quality? How often do you have external auditors come in and help you? What is your internal auditor function? And so that's really all of what's behind when you see some of the certificates that these cloud vendors have that show all of these steps that are part of an ISMS. And most of the big ones, of course, have what I call geographically appropriate data centers. And so if you've got some kind of case that's in Spain, I guess then you need to fly over there and use the... France. France is the one. And so they provide that for most geographic locations, or at least most differentiated geographical locations. Physically robust data centers that are built that are really very impressive, that have gates that you can't crash a truck through, and there's a turn in the driveway, and there's a very limited number of vendors that are allowed inside, and they have weeks of diesel fuel, and they have 2 power lines as they sit in the junction of power lines. So they take these things with appropriate degree of intense study and spending money on it. VESD is very early smoke detection. So I think if you're a smoker and you walk in, you may set these alarms off because they're really very sensitive. And of course, they have 24/7 staffing, some of which is on site, some of which is obviously remote. But again, the SLAs are going to kind of be the first thing that tells you kind of where they're at and what to look for. Obviously, as they get more and more secure, then the cost is going to go up a bit. And you want to tailor it to what your need really is. I mean, it's easy to overbuy, overspecify. A lot of them do, in fact, provide tools for you to help manage your security. And I'll talk about one I'm most familiar with, which is Azure, where Relativity 1 exists. There's something called Azure Security Center, which has all manner of things that talk about the security, things that you can control. Network security groups is one of them, where you can firewall off traffic amongst all the components internally to your system. Azure Anti-Malware, which is fairly sophisticated in the terms of tracking global threats on a very sub-second basis. Looking for all kinds of logins. They have Active Directory capabilities and so on. And so there's a lot of tools that really give you the power to do what you need and set your security that fits your business solution appropriately. And whatever you have on-prem, you can probably find it in the cloud as well. Event logging is something that's kind of fun. It's a little bit something I'm very interested in. But if you look at all the events that are available to feed into your logging system and your monitoring system, there's all the classical window things like the Windows firewalls will tell you if there's attacks coming in, logins to the lower level VMs, checks to see what versions of the things that you've deployed in. Excuse me. And these can be easily fed into whatever sophisticated monitoring and alerting tool that you have. And obviously, Central Identity Server is something that can really fill an entire talk about how to do that. But they provide the basis for you to do the right thing for your business. I think this is the last in this section. Encryption at rest. Encryption is often misused and misunderstood. There's a statistic I saw that said that of the 9 billion files that have been exfiltrated by attackers since 2013, only 4% were protected by encryption. And so it's good to encrypt data at rest, which you do through whole disk encryption, like BitLocker that you would do on-prem. But the thing about encryption is that at some point, depending on where the attacker happens to sit, they may be at a point past the point of encryption, because obviously the web server is going, if it's going to produce records for an authorized person to view, that data at some point has to be decrypted. So, the major advantage of encryption at rest is that if the system is turned off, physical theft of the device can't compromise the data, or that some other agency that isn't otherwise authorized can't go after the data. But when you look at encryption at rest, you want to understand who has control of the keys. Does the vendor have control of the keys for the whole disk encryption? Do you have control, or can you give control of the keys to your users? Because some customers are interested in having a control of the key that protects the data so that not even you as the vendor can get at that. And keys are, go ahead.
I didn't have anything.
So key rotation that's a whole other topic that could fill an entire talk about how to do it and how to make sure that you're following the right procedures. But that's a very important thing to understand. So you don't want keys that last forever.
Yeah, I think the non-reuse is also really important. Like, if you create a key or a password to share data with your vendors, try not to use the same one every time, because if you do that, it just increases the ability to, that one of those is going to get, if one of them gets intercepted, it's going to give more keys to other data that you intended to be private as well.
So we actually kind of talked about most of this. I think the only thing to add is how granular is the encryption? It's important to understand that. Is it like on a subscription basis, or can I encrypt with different keys, different segments of it? Application level encryption is something that people are looking for too, such that this would be where the user at the application level can control the key, so that different customers, different tenants in whatever it is that you're building has a different key. Encryption in transit's an easier topic. Use TLS 1.2. That's really kind of the end of the. That's really, don't use anything else. Make sure that you've got all the things that are certified. It's fairly easy to test. It's really easy to set up. There really isn't any reason not to use 1.2, with one kind of notable exception. GPG is a publicly available tool that you can use to kind of essentially manually encrypt files to send back and forth over an unsecure channel. Like if you want to send email that goes over a dubious route, then you can GPG a file, a PDF, or a report with a pre-shared public key with some other party so that they can see it, and nobody in between can bother with that. One of the things I think that's important, if you think about how many particular VMs or services that you might have in the thing that you build in the cloud, it's going to be many tens of machines, maybe 100 different machines. So how do you really know if those are properly configured? There's really sort of two ways to do that. One way is to build them and then kind of check them repeatedly as you would do the updates. And the other way is to build the machines from a prescriptive file or say a chef script that makes everything according to a preconceived plan that you've stored in your source control, so that you really know what it is that you've built. That really reduces the chance of something deviating from the standard. One of the nice things about the cloud, or VMs in general, but certainly in the cloud, is if a VM gets corrupted, you can kind of blow it away. But you kind of want to wait for Richard to see if there's something in there he wants to look at.
Or if it's
first.
a legal hold. Let's make sure it's
Or
not.
if it's a legal hold, yes. This is just a general advantage of the cloud in that you can readily patch the OS as you go through this. It's easy to see as a global thing what you maintain a baseline of what the configuration should be from the OS level and roll it out that way.
Okay. Thank you, sir. All right, so I made a pun here, cloud e-discovery, because I think it is. We'll talk a little bit about how you deal with all this stuff once it's there. So I wanted to give a list of clouds that I think people in this room probably have used or will use, either personally or in their capacity as an employee of a company. You see G Suite, Gmail, Google Drive. We're seeing a lot of organizations move to either Office 365 or some of the G Suite applications. And a lot of this has to do with what we said before, is you don't have to hire Exchange administrators, you don't have to buy hardware. You kind of offload some of the security considerations to Microsoft or Google, whoever the case may be. There's also storage locations, either Office 365's OneDrive, you have SharePoint, Box, Dropbox. I'm not going to read them all, but you guys get the idea. These are some of the things that we've encountered in e-discovery, and I assume you guys have as well, and probably others. So how do we collect this stuff? I wanted to talk a little bit about some tools that exist now that actually answer some of the needs here. It's not very elegant to have to go to each user and say, hey, can we export the data through your browser or some other way? And oftentimes creating service accounts is also not very fun in order to do this. Some of these help service accounts do their job more effectively. So I wanted to go through these one by one. The first is F-Response, which is really, think of that as a connector more than anything else. Everyone's familiar with enterprise type things like Ncase, FTK, that connect to endpoints. F-Response is basically the agnostic connector, where it'll provide the connection and then allow you to use whatever tool you want on top of that. So for example, let's say you have to collect from Google Drive for employees. You can literally get the authorization key, one service account, put their email address in, add the certificate file for that service account, the keys that Bill was just talking about, and it literally will mount their drive as a drive letter in your computer. And so what I do a lot of times is I've made a very robust robocopy script that will include logging, it will include times, it will include exceptions, it will include forcing collection of metadata and rewriting that to the collected file. And what that does is gives you a manifest of everything that happened during that collection. So you can see what the exceptions were, you can see the full breadth of things that were happening, and it also is just convenient to be able to have a drive letter. And you can also use any other collection tool you want on that drive letter. It's mounted just like a USB would be. So you can point Ncase or FTK or any of your favorite collection tools towards it. You can even copy paste. I wouldn't do that, but it's possible. Anna is another one. They're kind of in the realm of things like Zendesk, Slack, some of the other more difficult ones that you've seen a lot of tech startups that are being used. It uses user credentials to facilitate the collection, so you do need cooperation from the employee for those, but it does make it really a lot easier to gather data from these locations. Magnet Axiom, this is kind of one of the newer forensic products on the market in the last few years. It came from Internet Evidence Finder and is merged into a full forensic product that they're continuously developing. And they're starting to add cloud collection. Like Anna, a lot of it depends on user credentials. So again, you have to have compliance. Now, in the context of an e-discovery event, you've issued a legal hold. The general counsel may say you need to comply and cooperate with whomever is doing the collection, but it does add a level of trying to reach them and run them down and getting whatever credentials you need for it. So just be aware of it. Eureka software is kind of it's one of the newer collection tools that I've seen, and it does a lot more than just collect, which is why I really like it. It's got the ability to collect data like any of your other enterprise ones, but you can also install it without anyone knowing, so the employee doesn't necessarily know. It also uses the endpoint to index itself. And when it creates that index, it also searches for private data, sensitive data, or any kind of data that you give in terms of criteria. So if you say, okay, we want to put this on the marketing department's computers, we also want it to scan their shares. It's going to go and find things out there that people may not want to have on shares, like passports, social security numbers, birth certificates, things that employees sometimes mistakenly put on file shares. So it's a good way to provide an enterprise connection and also have some intelligence on threats and risks that you have on your endpoints. And there's a lot of applicability for privacy. So I would definitely check that one out. Elcomsoft is one that I've used before for doing iCloud backup collections. So this one will actually connect to Apple servers that Bill was talking about in their data center. And assuming you have the right credentials, you can essentially pull a backup of their phone down from there. So the cases where this is interesting is where you may have a bad actor who decides to wipe his phone before turning it in. Let's say he's terminated and is mad, and he wipes it. If you can show that he was accessing iCloud on a regular basis or had backups sending there, you might be able to file a motion in court and get a judge to compel him to give up his credentials in order to get this backup. So don't forget that this exists. It's not just phone is wiped, let's turn away and run, because there's also the potential that they have backups in their computers. And if they have backups in the computers, they also potentially have the keys to the backup. So look at that one for sure. For Gmail, I found that some companies are not using Gmail's Vault, which makes a lot of e-discovery easier. So what we found is that there's a couple providers out there that are kind of creating a Vault-like experience. All of these, the Backupify, Spanning, and UpSafe all give the ability to collect from Google Mail for Business without the need for user authentication. So it works on a service level account, which means you don't need to send the user an authorization key. You don't need to get them to click it. You don't need to follow up with them. You don't need to track it all. You just make a service account and you do it. So those are all good. They're relatively cheap. I think it's like $36 a user a year, I think, generally, which is, if you need to export data from, 40 custodians, just do the math, but it saves you a lot of time trying to run them down. X1 is really good for social networks, whether it be Facebook, LinkedIn, even just regular web pages. You can collect it in a way that, at least will give you kind of a manifest of at least as forensically sound as you can from a website. Gives you some information about that site that you can use. I would definitely check out that for social networks. One thing to be cautious about, and this applies, at least the one I've heard of the most, is Box.net. They have API limitations that you generally subscribe to as an enterprise. So you might say, we pay $10,000 for so many activities on the API. Maybe it's $100,000 a month. Watch out when you're collecting from them, because if you use these collection tools via the API, you may exceed your quota and get a bill. So before you go collecting, you might want to find out who in IT arranged that, find out what your SLA says about how many pulls you get, and make sure that you have adequate numbers of API calls in order to do it. I can't really tell you how to best do that, but I think what I would say is, see how much you use in an average month, test it with a couple users, see how it affects your API limit, and then extrapolate for the rest of them. And that's kind of what we found works at least reasonably well for these. I think I'm going to move on to the next one because we're running a little bit short on time. So Google Docs. Now, I think all of us know e-discovery is not perfect. Regardless of how we may try, you're always going to have exceptions in processing, collection, and just data sometimes is really weird. And you always come across things that are not fun. This is an example of a recent collection I was doing from Google Docs where you see here, export size limit exceeded. And message too large to be exported. And you're like, okay, now what? Thanks for telling me. And basically, it's an exception. So you have a choice of either going to get it from the front end, from the user, or finding some other way to get it, because through the API, it's not going to happen. And I think I've got I did some research about what that means. Now, so the Google Docs limitations are here. Some of the formats are like 50 megabytes. And honestly, I think the file that was in question on the last slide was like a PowerPoint. It was like 124 megabytes, which was huge. But I guess they just made one for the entire day session. I don't know what it was, but you're going to come across these. Cloud collection is not perfect. I've never seen one cloud collection that was perfect. And all those tools that I gave you, I think are probably the cutting edge on this. You're going to run into issues like this. Be aware of them, and just know that that they exist. You're not going to be able to get around the fact that Google's limitation is this on the API. You can still get it on the front end potentially, but not through their API export. So know this ahead of time, that when you let's say you mount it with fresponse like I was talking, you robocopy, and you get an error like this on the last slide. Yeah, you're going to see that. Don't freak out. You might see it 100 times. And this is why I'm saying document. Use the copy function of the copy log function of robocopy to actually document what's coming through, so that you know what things you may have to go back for. Here are some examples. I know it's small, but you can see on the bottom, this is literally the fresponse interface. Timeouts, errors with specific files. It's just, this is kind of the rolling, how it looks. And also on the top, if you look, the parts I highlighted in yellow, those are actually, it's kind of as far as I can tell, a GUID for Google Docs. It adds that at the end of the file name. So you might have files that are exactly the same. Like you see in the middle, CSM interview, there's 3 of them. Well, there's different versions of it. But sometimes you'll see different versions of the same file that they back up. And so you're going to have those, but the names are not going to be the same. So you can surely use MD5 or other hashing to find duplicates, but just know that your file names are not going to be clean. They're going to look like this, coming from Google Docs. Foreign language Google Docs, you may see this on your screen with question marks if it can't deal with Unicode correctly. It seems that it copies okay, but at least in the display on, in the command prompt, it's not going to look pretty. Just don't freak out if you see it. You just make sure you check on the back end on your file system to see if those foreign language characters actually came through. So how do we deal with these? Exception handling. I would say test your solution before you have a real case. It's not fun when you're having, you're under a deadline and you have to collect and you get errors like I just showed you, and you're like, oh man, what do I do? And you keep trying and it keeps timing out, or you get access denied. All these things can happen. So test your solution and kind of understand what the limitations are and how much you can push it. Like if you're mounting a Google Drive over the internet using one of these tools, don't try to collect 40 at a time. Like it's just not going to work. You're going to get, Google's going to notice, and you're going to get throttled. You might get kicked off for a period of time. So try to just set expectations with whomever you're collecting data for, that the more custodians you have, the more computers you may have to set up to actually connect to it. Because you're not going to be able to run 40 at a time. I'm telling you, the most I've been able to do is, 5 to 10 via robocopy, and that was acceptable for reducing errors. Any more than that, and I saw more errors, so I had to go back. Try to sort out the bugs with software providers. If you find something that you legitimately think is not working right, ask them. Say, hey, I found this. And a lot of times they'll say, oh, the provider changed something in their API and didn't tell us. Or, it's been too soon and we haven't had a chance to develop it, but we're working on it. So, don't be afraid to reach out, because a lot of times, they've got how many cloud providers did I have in that first slide? Like 25, 30? Keeping up with all those things is a full-time job in itself. I guess the best example, or the best advice I can give you is, when you have these exceptions, document your process. Write down what you did, what happened, what steps, did you try and repeat it? Did you try and recollect? Because in the end of the day, if you're the person who's going to be deposed on this, you're going to want to know what you did. And you may have an opportunistic plaintiff who says, well, all these exceptions, you didn't collect it. You spoliated data. you can see where that's going to go, and you're going to be the one in the hot seat having to answer why, oh, well, I tried 3 times, I looked up the size of the file, I contacted, and go through the steps of what you did. Document your process and save the collection logs. And like I said before, e-discovery, the standard is it's not perfection. If you guys see Judge Peck walking around, ask him. I hope he'll agree with me. But just be reasonable. So processing data in the cloud. I'm going to move a little quickly because I want to fit the privacy stuff in. We already talked about some of the bandwidth things in the considerations there. One thing that I think people are worried about with processing data in the cloud is that it feels slower than just plugging your drive in. Like if you're right there and your servers are within your building or in the same town, you can just go there and connect the data. And it copies a lot faster over those connections than it does over the wire. So there are services that you can send drives in and upload them. But as soon as you put something in FedEx, it just feels slower for some reason. I know like just there the next day, but then it's like plugging it in and checking on it. So that's something that I think we all need to get used to as we move to processing in the cloud. The one thing I mentioned before is kind of using endpoints as their own processing. And Eureka is doing an interesting thing where they're developing an index of the computer on the computer, which is great because you're using spare computing cycles that your company already has and assets that they already own to do the dirty work. Categorize the data, search the data, cull the data before you even collect it. You could probably collect on search terms, although I don't recommend it. I think you should still be a little bit conservative about that, unless you have an agreement with opposing counsel. But try to think about, you have a company with, let's say there's 1,000 custodians, and their computers are sitting there. I mean, the legacy model of how this outer industry works would be, okay, let's go collect it all, amass a huge pile of crap that we have to cull through. And we all know it's expensive, and it's time-consuming, and most of the time, 90% of it's not even used. So, I think try to look for ways to leverage the cloud and current technologies to reduce kind of the old way of doing things. And this is something that a technology that I've been testing and have found has worked very well and has really helped clients, especially in investigations, when you need to install something surreptitiously and not have anyone know about it and get your job done. So make sure you think about that as an option. I kind of talked about the transaction costs. I want to move on a little bit because we're running out of time. I want to tell you about this one. This is a great example of how you can leverage the cloud for better processing. Bill mentioned password cracking. One of the things that that I did this year was embraced cloud password cracking, which I use Alchemsoft's distributed password cracker, and we had, I guess I've got it in here, there's like 40 files. I set up compute instances, GPU compute instances in Amazon AWS Cloud in Ireland and Portland. I think I had 16 of these running, probably in each location actually. What I did is I used an aggregation of leaked password databases that are out there from all these breaches we've had, because they're really a great source, because they're real. So I aggregated all those. I used some of the Alchemsoft hybrid dictionaries, and I basically made, I turned on, variances so that it will say like, oh, if there's an H, use a capital H2, use 4 instead of A, all those things. And basically, within 14 days, all 40 files got cracked. And the client was very happy because it was a trade secret matter, and they found out the guy was stealing like trading models that were worth, I think in the 8 figures, they said, on the, in the public domain. So, this is a great example of how you can leverage the cloud, where if you had this specific thing and you had to do it in-house, the amount of hardware you'd have to put together, it would be, you're talking tens of thousands of dollars. And setup time, and so here you spin it up. Alchemsoft's already done the work. You have your agent, which can be your computer, and you just turn them loose, and have a good password dictionary. Let's see. I think this is the last slide before privacy. So I'm going to turn it over to Jason after this. But I think we're all pretty familiar with hosting data in the cloud now. It's kind of been the norm. Relativity 1 is kind of the news. Everyone's heard about that last year, this year. Your current vendors also have their own private clouds. I mean, they've got distributed servers that hold your data and databases and users and the native files. And that's kind of the definition of a cloud. So the way I think of it is it's either, is it a public cloud or a private cloud? It's not a question of if it's a cloud. If it's a single server, it's not really a cloud. But the vendors sitting here in this room and the ones you're going to talk to today or have already talked to, they're running their own cloud. It's a distributed network of computers working for a common purpose. So this is kind of where things have been going, and I think will continue to go in some respects. Just the one thing I would caution is understand some of the limitations. One of the things that we touched on before was, when you're in a particular provider's cloud, you may be limited in terms of how you get data in and out of it. Can you plug things in? How do you apply specific software to it? And some of the things I wanted to mention was like BrainSpace. They have a booth up there. I like BrainSpace. I think it does good work. It's fancy looking, and honestly, we've had very good luck with it. You need relativity behind it, and you need to have a connection. You can't just throw native data in it, so you've got to have a connection to it. So, if we're using Relativity 1, the question I think some of us have been asking is, hey, I have tools that some of these amazing developers are creating that enhance relativity. How am I going to be able to plug those in? And I think that's still being worked out. And I encourage you guys to talk to your relativity reps about that. But I guess what I see is eventually, Relativity 1 and your vendors are going to be able to allow connections from those specific tools you want to use to enhance your experience. I think that's where it's going to go. So I'm going to turn it over to Jason. I know we only have like 10 minutes, but it's important stuff.
All right, so hello. I'm going to talk about data privacy, but I'm actually going to sidetrack real quick and just make an observation. A lot of what Rick was talking about when he was talking about preservation, you may have noticed this, he's talking about getting the stuff out of there and someplace else. So preservation and collection kind of bleed together. Why is that? And that's because data that's in these third-party clouds, maybe it's, from a preservation standpoint, we as practitioners aren't going to be super comfortable about that because it's a question of, can it be changed, can it be deleted, where could it go? So we're much happier throwing the security blanket around it and rushing it out of the burning building, so we have it right here. But that could be an issue when it comes to privacy, and not just in Europe, where lots of people are excited and talking about, but even domestically in some states. Plenty of states have data privacy laws that would come into play, especially if you're talking about some of these situations where things bleed over from, oh yeah, I use whatever, fill in the blank, for business and for my personal stuff. Oh, and by the way, my wife puts pictures of stuff up there too. And so suddenly there's a crossroads there about privacy and compliance that you've got to be aware of, and it could be a minefield, especially if you've got somebody who maybe not only is not friendly to the case, but maybe is adverse, a disgruntled employee, or the IP investigations and things that Rick was talking about. So the laws that are in play are interesting, and they're all over the world. And it's certainly, the quote at the top is certainly helpful to know that 92% of everything we do will be in the cloud. And that's what they said in 2016. That's probably we're going to get there. And in this world where it's interesting, I've been doing this so long that I saw thin clients, and then we went away from them, and now we're back. Thin clients, I think, are the future, and I think it's probably this cloud environment and solution is only going to explode. But all the checks on that, when data privacy comes into play, are laws domestically in the United States that protect certain categories of information. So we're all familiar with HIPAA and GLB and some of these other domestic US laws that govern how companies can store and manage data in certain families. So health information, credit card information, or banking financial information. Other parts of the world do not make that distinction between, oh, this is we care about and this we don't. In particular, Europe, parts of Asia, some parts of Central and South America, who have adopted kind of a European model of data privacy, can look at something that they define as personal information or personal data, and that is very broadly defined. In fact, it is anything which either by itself or in combination with something else that you have can lead to the identification of a person. So what are we talking about? Are we talking about, you know, the names and social security numbers and addresses? Sure, that's true, but we're also talking about just the names. We're also talking about just a list of employee ID numbers without the names, because that combined with something else in the HRIS system could lead to the identification of a person. So suddenly all that is protected information, and in certain parts of the world, it's a downright crime, not only just to work with it or export it, but also, you know, to have it outside of the country. So some of the countries here, in the limited time, I'll just tell you, GDPR is huge, and that really very tightly controls what a company can do with, in terms of processing, and copying, even if you don't look at it, is processing, by the way, of personal data. And that's before you even think about a transfer, which could also implicate an entirely new philosophical conversation about clouds. So you've got a cloud, and you've got stuff that's distributed all across multiple servers, potentially across the world. From a jurisdictional standpoint, where is it? Is it in Europe? Is it not? And can I subpoena an American company like Microsoft and have them export data that they have for European nationals, which they can access in, you know, from California, but maybe it physically is located on servers that are distributed only in Europe? Or how does that work from a law enforcement standpoint? And there's actually the Microsoft case, which you guys might be familiar with. It's going in front of the Supreme Court this term because there's a big disagreement about that, and because Microsoft doesn't believe that they have to do that in response to a criminal subpoena in the US for an export of data that includes European nationals. Why? Because of European data privacy law. So where that goes remains to be seen. But there's a lot of trial court opinions, both which have grown to recognize the importance of data privacy law in terms of international comity, and that is the respect of the laws of nations. One nation respects the laws of the other nation, or not. Now, so the other two here, Russia and China, are interesting, not just because of data privacy laws, which certainly exist to some degree in both those countries, but because of data localization requirements, which come into play, especially if you're thinking about, from an IT standpoint, data storage or managing information. You may actually be required to keep the data physically within the territory of Russia and China if it involves Russian and Chinese citizens. So I would caution anyone involving data transfers or cloud environments for a multinational company just to be aware that there are issues here. Certainly more than I have time to go into in 3 minutes.
Yeah, but Jason, on your point, if you have a vendor who's hosting data in Russia, but you have people here accessing it, that's considered transfer.
Well, yes, which would would be a bigger issue from a European standpoint than from a Russian standpoint. But yeah, so in a real world scenario, let's say Rick's doing an investigation. We've got a company with employees here stateside and in Europe, say in Germany, and Rick wants to pull down data from Office 365 or something that the company is using. The same issues that would apply for European data privacy would apply on his cloud collections just as they would if he's flying over there, grabbing a hold of somebody's laptop and doing a collection out of it. In other words, that's a transfer. South Korea is up there. I think it's important to list them just because they're actually proud of the fact that they have some of the strictest data privacy laws in all of Asia, and it's certainly worth considering. So you and GDPR and your provider. So in essence, it's important to know that, and this is a great quote too, the cloud provider's compliance is not your own. And that's positively going to be true when GDPR takes effect in May of 2018, which distributes responsibilities and actually liability beyond something that they used to just say. They narrow it down on the data controller and said, all right, who's the data controller? That's the one that's going to be left holding the bag or wearing the handcuffs potentially if something really bad goes wrong. In GDPR, liability is spread out. And what does that mean? That means that you can be fined or subject to lawsuits from data subjects. So that could be the customer, that could be the employee, that could be the wife of the person who has stuff on the cloud. If you violate their fundamental privacy rights. Also, just to note, there is a fundamental right to privacy in Europe, which is also sometimes a bit of a foreign concept to us in the US, but it's there. In addition to that, each country has their own supervisory authority or data privacy authority that is responsible for going in and enforcing the rules. They have the right under the ability under GDPR to fine organizations, and there's a tiered fine structure. The fines start at 3% of a maximum is 3% of the global net income, and the maximum is 4%. That's a lot of money for a lot of companies, and you cannot be cute and say, well, we only make this much in Germany. No, it's global. It's not just, if you have a separate entity in country, they're going to calculate it for all the companies and all the families of companies. So the fines are real and the consequences are serious. GDPR takes effect May 25th, 2018. So get your data now. No, not true. Actually, the Data Privacy Directive is still in place now, is currently in place. The fines are a lot lower, though. There's a lot to talk about. I think all I can do now, now that we're out of time, is just point you all, if you've got interest in more information about GDPR. CIFAR did a 4 webinar series. Each of them is about an hour long about GDPR and what companies need to know about it. So I'd encourage you to go check that out on our website. And I think unless someone's got closing remarks, I'll make them. And thank everybody for their time. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone.